Nefesh B'Nefesh. This is an Israeli government agency that in the United States raises money tax-exempt. It has tax-exempt status, and I would not be surprised at all if it has the same status in Canada, which is scandalous, because a charitable purpose can, I think, never include dispossessing people of their land and their rights. But this organization, Nefesh B'Nefesh, tries to recruit Canadians to go and live in the occupied territories and in Israel, in the north, to settle. Now, the condition is they have to be Jewish as defined by the State of Israel, because, of course, the State of Israel doesn't recognize all people who call themselves Jewish as Jews. Another problem. So, a Canadian has more rights in Palestine than a Palestinian. Because meanwhile, while the Israeli government is recruiting and paying Canadians to move to Palestine, Palestinians born there have no right to return, no right to enter the country. In Gaza, you have 1.5 million people who are effectively imprisoned for one crime, is that they're not Jews. 80% are refugees from lands that are now in Israel. The vast majority of those lands are empty. No one is living on them. But they're not allowed to return. I mean, you have a land without a people for a people without a land. It's a good description of the Palestinians in Gaza. Their land is empty, and they are cooped up in this giant prison for one reason, that they're not Jews. If you change one thing about Palestinians in Gaza or in the refugee camps of Lebanon or Jordan or anywhere else, one thing about them, their religion, then they would be not only allowed to return, but they would be subsidized, given homes, given jobs, given training, and so on. We're not talking about Palestinians being people. You say, well, every country has a right to control immigration. We're not talking about immigrants. We're talking about the indigenous people of the country who are subjected to these racist apartheid policies. We're talking about the indigenous people of the country. That is the difference. Israel came, they cleansed the land of its indigenous people, and they said, now we're a Jewish state. Well, you're not Jewish? Sorry, not our problem. Well, that might be fine for them, but it's not an injustice, it's not an outrage that the rest of us are bound to accept. And this is what this struggle is about. It's about recognizing the full equality of all human beings. The moment we're in, I think, is crucial, because Palestinians have asked the world to help them to do it, to help them to end these injustices. In 2005, almost 200 Palestinian civil society organizations, representing the broad spectrum of Palestinian society inside Palestine and in the diaspora, issued what's now known as the Palestinian Civil Society Call for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. This was issued in 2005, coming up to 6 years ago. And it calls very simply for a comprehensive global grassroots campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions on Israel until Israel meets 3 conditions. Number 1, ending the occupation of all Arab land that began in 1967, ending the occupation and colonization. Number 2, ending all forms of discrimination and inequality, legal and de facto and de jure, against Palestinian citizens of Israel, the 20% of Israeli citizens who are the survivors and descendants of those who managed to remain behind in 1948, and 3, respecting, promoting, and implementing the right of return for Palestinian refugees in accordance with international law. There is nothing racist about these goals. These are goals rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They say that all people are created equal, all people have a right to live in their own land without being thrown off it because they're the wrong color or the wrong height or the wrong religion or the wrong anything else. Nothing racist about that, nothing anti-Semitic about it, Mr. Ignatieff, and nothing intolerant or anti-freedom. These are supposedly the values which Canada stands for. Those are the values that are contained in the Palestinian civil society call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. This campaign is modeled on the one that in the 1970s and 80s, those of us who are old enough to remember, participated in proudly when it came to apartheid in South Africa. And it's been endorsed by all of our brothers and sisters in South Africa who are veterans of that struggle, by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who has been unflinching in his support despite the slander and the libel against him by supporters of apartheid in Israel. It's supported by COSATU, the Confederation of South African Trade Unions, and so many other individuals and organizations who are veterans of the anti-apartheid struggle. I was disappointed when last year Margaret Atwood, who I think after timber and oil shale and natural gas is Canada's largest export. When Margaret Atwood accepted a $1 million prize, the Dan Prize from Tel Aviv University, despite a plea from Palestinian civil society for her not to do so, that doing so would really be a slap in the face to the Palestinians who are struggling for their rights. And nevertheless, she decided to go ahead with that, and I think really didn't defend herself very well. But of course I mention this because Margaret Atwood very proudly supported the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement in solidarity with South Africa. So we must ask our public figures and celebrities and authors and cultural giants to be consistent, that you cannot say we're against apartheid in South Africa, but we're perfectly fine with it as long as it's Palestinians who are suffering. We must ask that they're consistent. The tactic of boycott, divestment, and sanctions is perfectly legitimate. It is, in my view, I think of it as a technology. It's not an end in itself. We boycott, we divest, we impose sanctions in order to bring about an outcome. That outcome is to see human rights implemented, to see people's rights restored, to see all the people who live in the country have a possibility of a decent, dignified life of equality. That's the goal. BDS is simply a tactic, a technology. It doesn't target Israelis as individuals, as some of the counterclaims try to sort of scare people. It targets a system, and there are clear principles that you can find if you go to the BDS movement website, for example. It doesn't target Jews. One of the real slanders is to say that this is a boycott of Jews. This is totally wrong, and anyone who calls for a boycott of people because they're Jews is absolutely not a part of this movement and is totally on the wrong track. And in fact, many Jews in Canada, in the United States, and indeed in Palestine and Israel are part of this movement. You have groups like Boycott from Within, which is an Israeli group that advocates for international boycott in support of Palestinian rights. So anyone can join this movement. All you have to do is believe that in the stated goals, which are completely consistent with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Let's compare some of the tactics of the BDS movement and Israel, which objects to BDS. Academic boycott. A lot of people are very uncomfortable with academic boycott. What does this mean? Does it mean boycotting individual Israeli students or professors? Absolutely not. We shouldn't do that. We should not shun people because they're from Israel. What it means is boycotting connections and programs between our universities and Israeli universities. Because Israeli universities are complicit in so many of the human rights abuses. The deep connection between Israeli universities and the military, for example. The fact that universities like Tel Aviv University are built on the ruins of Palestinian villages that were ethnic cleansed, and there is not even any acknowledgement of that. You go to Tel Aviv University, you don't see any marker that says this used to be the village of Sheikh Mohannis, whose residents are now in refugee camps in Lebanon or Gaza or Jordan or wherever they may be. The universities are complicit in this, and that's quite well documented. When we talk about academic freedom, shouldn't that be for everyone? Shouldn't it be for Palestinian university professors and students in Gaza who, living in a prison, are unable to travel for research, whose universities cannot form connections with the University of Regina or Toronto or York or wherever it is, who can't benefit from being able to be part of the world of research because they're living under siege. Shouldn't we ask Israel to end its boycott of Palestinian schools and universities? While supporters of BDS call for a boycott of Israeli universities, 2 days ago, Israeli F-16s bombed the Islamic University in Gaza, flattening a number of its buildings. This was not widely reported in the news. We did not hear any calls for a no-fly zone over Gaza or the West Bank. Nobody's calling for Israeli universities to be bombed with F-16s. During Israel's attack on Gaza in winter 2008-2009, of the 640 schools, primary and secondary schools in the Gaza Strip, of 640 schools, 18 were completely destroyed by Israeli bombing, 8 of them kindergartens, and more than 240 were damaged. So half the schools in Gaza were damaged or destroyed by Israeli bombing. How about that for academic boycott? And almost none of these schools have been rebuilt because Israel still forbids cement and steel and iron and other building supplies from coming in to the Gaza Strip. So before we talk about, so anybody who says to you, look, we support academic freedom, say, what about academic freedom for Palestinians? Now, piece of news that came up yesterday in Haaretz. Bill to punish anti-Israel boycotters passes first Knesset hurdle. So, and you can see this movement has become such a threat to Israel that they're trying to outlaw it. The Knesset, of course, being the Israeli parliament on Monday,